Well, I think as a general statement, it could be more open. We have some pretty good transparency on the House of Representatives side, which obviously I'm more familiar with than I am the Senate side. But, we have 6 budget review units on the House side, and each of those units really drills down into their aspect, their discipline of the budget. Like, for example, I'm privileged to be the chair of the Budget Committee on Education, so my committee is responsible for the largest piece of the state budget, which is primary and secondary education, which is almost 50% of the budget. So when we're in the process of drafting the budget on the House side and making our recommendations to the full Appropriation and Revenue Committee that I'm a member of also, we have intense testimony. We invite in stakeholders within primary and secondary. We have recommendations from them about what their needs are, where the priorities ought to be in our precious funding that we have. And so, I'm confident about the open part of it there. The thing that I'm a little disappointed in that I think could be improved is that invariably, as you know, there's 3 pieces to the budget. The governor presents his portion, and then we take it and tweak it a bit and trim around the edges and then send it to the Senate, and they do the same thing, and there's never an agreement. So it goes into a conference committee and into sometimes a so-called free conference. I would like to see that conference committee more open to members of the General Assembly as well as the public. And I think our leadership is in favor of that. And sometimes I've seen that the President of the Senate is not particularly enamored with opening up the process during that conference committee. But this is the public's business. It's the most important thing we do as a member of the Kentucky General Assembly, and that's craft a budget. And I think the process is better served if it is open. And one thing I might add is a digression, Owen. There's been a lot of talk about, well, you all didn't get your job done in this last session, and you have to go back up in a special session at $60,000 a day. And I was frustrated about that, and I didn't like that happened either, and I wish it hadn't happened. But fortunately, we went back up and crafted out a pretty good budget with no new taxes, I might add, in as short as possible period of time. But what I want people to remember is back in 2003, matter of fact, that was the first year I served in the legislature, we passed a bill in the Kentucky House, I think it was House Bill 27 at the time, that would have amended Kentucky's Constitution and said that if we don't pass a budget during a budget year in the 60-day period that we're in session, that we would stay in session until we pass a budget with no compensation. I think that's great policy. Unfortunately, the Kentucky Senate didn't even have a committee hearing on that. I would love to see that legislation passed. Not to force us to do it, because we ought to have to do it without that legislation, but for the voters' sake, that we ought to do that and to demand responsibility. And if we have to stay up there, I don't think we should get paid to do it. But, back to the tenant question, the process can always be more open. And I think it's better served as transparent as it can be. Now, we've done a lot of things to give the public more access to the budget. Owen, over the web now, we've got one of the more higher acclaimed websites called Open Door that individuals can go onto the web, go onto that page and find out by department, by agency, by cabinet, where monies are being spent, what contracts are being let, what salaries are being paid. More transparency about the way their precious tax dollars are being spent. So we need that transparency. We need more accountability in our state government, just like we need accountability at the federal level. But the process on the House side works pretty well. One thing, as we're talking about this in general, about the budget that we need to do, the governor sent over a budget this past session that was predicated on gaming revenues. Well, that was kind of dead on arrival for reasons we talked about earlier, just not the traction there for passing expanded gaming. So normally when we get the governor's budget, we'll trim around the edges and change up some priorities, but I mean, by and large, we accept a big part of his presentation. Well, this time we had to start from scratch because his budget was going nowhere. So we lost a lot of time by having to start from ground zero again, as opposed to start from the threshold of his budget. We've learned from that, and we're going to be starting, even though next year is not a budget year in 11, other than some budget adjustments we'll probably have to make, but we're going to start much earlier gathering information getting ours together so that we don't get in that predicament again, that if in fact the governor sends something over that we just can't live with, that we've already got a baseline on where a lot of revenues are and where our forecasts are, so that we can move more expeditiously.
As you're aware, often in the past, the final budget document has been completed with very little time for members to review it before being asked to vote on it. What sort of remedies do you see for that type of situation to ensure that lawmakers have adequate time to review that document before being asked for their approval?
Well, just like the public certainly needs to deserve what the ingredients of the budget are, I think the legislators who are drafting that policy need to understand what's in that document. Unlike we all heard about the fiasco with national health care reform and how voluminous that was and how few people really knew what the ingredients were. But, you know, of course, some of us that are in the budget process have an advantage because we see it going all the way through and we're very familiar with every element of it. And then our leadership does a really good job of briefing us on the conference committee report. Before we vote on it, we spend hours being briefed about it, and I should suspect that the other chamber does too. But it would be much better served if we could have a period of like at least 48 hours to where every legislator has to receive a copy of the final agreed to compromise before we vote on it. In other words, the product of the conference committee, 48 hours before we're asked to vote on it. That way we can sit down, go through it, make sure we're comfortable with it, ask questions. I just think that's good business and good policy, and that it makes sense, and not get into that situation where, you know, we're presented with the conference document at 8 o'clock on the sine die day, and then we've got to vote on it and adjourn by midnight. You know, it does no one any good to vote on a document that you're not familiar with, and then you have unintended consequences. And then, you know, you hear voters say, well, didn't you know that was in the package? You know, and when you say no, that's pretty irresponsible. So I think to have that time would be good, and that goes back to maybe starting a little earlier in the process, which I think we're going to try to do in this next budget cycle, so that hopefully we'll have more time at the end to get that information out.